The blue folder hit the table hard enough to make Charles flinch. Anne didn't sit down. She looked at William, then at her brother, and said, "You never promised Camilla's family that estate." Charles almost looked relieved. Then Anne finished the sentence. "You promised them you would force William to give it to them." Nobody moved. Not William. Not the private secretary standing beside the locked door. Not even Camilla, who had entered the room, carrying a second document that Anne wasn't supposed to know existed, because the argument was no longer about a house. It was about what Charles had quietly offered, using power that would eventually belong to his son. And the most humiliating detail was sitting in Anne's folder, in Charles's own handwriting. What follows is a dramatized royal scenario inspired by public family tensions, not a claim that these private conversations have been verified. The confrontation had started 48 hours earlier, when William received a request that looked almost insultingly ordinary. Continued access. That was the phrase. Not ownership. Not inheritance. Continued access to a private country residence connected to the wider royal estate network. The request claimed that Camilla's children, Tom Parker Bowles and Laura Lopes, had been given assurances that the property would remain available to their family after Charles was gone. William read the first page, then the second. By the third, his expression changed, because this wasn't written like a request. It was written like a reminder. A reminder of an agreement William had never made. The document referred to the understanding established by His Majesty. That one sentence changed everything. William called his legal advisor. The advisor read it twice, removed his glasses, then asked the question nobody wanted to answer. What understanding? There was no signed transfer, no trust naming Camilla's children, no deed, no formal right of residence, nothing that could survive a serious legal challenge. So why did the request sound so confident? Because someone inside the palace had apparently allowed Camilla's family to believe William's consent was already guaranteed. But William wasn't king yet. Charles was. Which meant Charles had made a promise involving authority he did not possess. That should have ended the matter. It didn't. It made it worse. William sent back a short response. No decision would be considered until every document connected to the alleged promise had been produced. Not copied, not summarized, produced, the originals. The reply reached Charles before it reached Camilla. That was the first mistake. The second was Charles deciding he could resolve everything privately before Anne heard about it. He couldn't. Anne had already heard. She arrived at Windsor the following morning with no announcement, no entourage, and no patience for the secretary, who tried to delay her outside the private rooms. "I need 10 minutes with my brother." The secretary glanced toward the closed door. "His Majesty is occupied." Anne didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. Then he can stop being occupied. 3 minutes later, she was inside. Charles was standing beside the window with a letter in his hand. Anne recognized William's seal, so she knew. Charles tried to soften it. He said the request had been misunderstood. Anne asked which part. The property? The promise? Or the fact that William had discovered both at the same time? Charles turned away. That was answer enough. But Anne hadn't come to accuse him. Not yet. She wanted the original wording. "What exactly did you tell Camilla?" Charles said nothing had been finalized. Anne stepped closer. "That isn't what I asked." Still nothing. Then Charles made the admission that would drag William directly into the fight. He said he had given Camilla his personal assurance that her family would always be treated with dignity. Sounds harmless, doesn't it? It wasn't, because dignity had somehow become access. Access had somehow become permanent use. Permanent use had somehow become inheritance. Anne saw the progression immediately. She asked Charles whether he had ever used the words lifetime protection. His face tightened. There it was, not a confession. Something more revealing. Recognition. Charles had used words broad enough to comfort Camilla, but vague enough to avoid committing himself. The problem was that Camilla hadn't heard vagueness. She had heard a guarantee, and someone had written it down. That document was sitting in the locked red box behind Charles's desk. Anne didn't know that yet, but Camilla did. Charles told Anne that the matter could be handled without involving William further. Anne actually laughed, not because it was funny, because it was impossible. William controlled the future decision. Charles had created the expectation. Camilla's family believed the outcome had already been settled. But somehow, William was supposed to stay outside the room while everyone discussed what he would eventually be forced to surrender. Anne looked at her brother and said, "You didn't protect William from this. You protected yourself from telling Camilla no." That landed hard. Charles walked toward the desk, then stopped before reaching it. Anne noticed. Why stop there? Why glance at the lower drawer? Why place himself between Anne and the red box? She didn't challenge him. She left. That should have reassured Charles. Instead, it terrified him. Because Anne only walks away that quietly when she already knows where to look next. By that afternoon, she was sitting across from William. He had spread the access request across a long table, each page marked with small handwritten notes. William didn't ask whether Anne believed the promise existed. He asked who had written it. That was smarter. Anne pointed to a phrase buried near the bottom of page 4. Shall remain protected regardless of succession. William stared at it. Succession. Not death. Not retirement. Succession. Whoever drafted that sentence had anticipated the moment William inherited responsibility. This wasn't just about preserving Camilla's family after Charles. It was about binding William before he ever had the chance to object. But there was a problem. Royal property doesn't become private family property because someone was given an emotional assurance over dinner. William knew that. Anne knew that. The lawyers definitely knew that. So why write a request that could collapse the moment it was examined? Because the people behind it didn't expect examination. They expected embarrassment to do the work. Imagine the headlines. William removes Camilla's children. William breaks his father's promise. William humiliates the Queen's family after the King's death. The legal claim may have been weak. The emotional trap was vicious. If William approved it, he surrendered control. If he refused, he became the cruel stepson throwing a grieving family out. That was the real inheritance Charles had left him. Not property. Blame. Anne leaned back and said, "This was designed so you lose even when you win." But William had noticed something she hadn't. The wording changed halfway through the document. Early pages described access as something that may be considered. Later pages called it something that shall remain protected. May became shall. A possibility became a command. William asked for the earlier draft. Nobody could find it. Then Anne remembered the red box, the drawer Charles had blocked, the place he didn't want her standing near. She went back that evening. This time, William came with her. Charles was furious before they even entered the room. He accused William of treating a family matter like a criminal investigation. William didn't react. He placed the 2 contradictory pages on the desk. Which one did you approve? Charles looked at the first, then the second, and for one brief moment, he seemed genuinely confused. That was the twist nobody expected. Charles hadn't seen the stronger version. At least, that's what he claimed. So who had changed it? Camilla entered before he could answer. No announcement. No hesitation. She was carrying the red box. She placed it beside William's papers and told Anne that nobody had changed Charles's promise. They clarified it. Anne's eyes went straight to the box. Who is they? Camilla ignored the question. She turned to William and said the arrangement had been discussed years earlier, when nobody knew what position her children would face after Charles became king. She said Tom and Laura had never asked for titles, never asked for public roles, never asked to become working royals. All they had wanted was certainty. William asked, certainty over what? Camilla opened the box. Inside was a handwritten note from Charles. One page, undated, unsigned, but clearly written in the deeply personal language of a husband trying to reassure his wife. Charles had written that Camilla's family would never be made to feel disposable. He wrote that they would be treated with consideration. He wrote that William would understand the importance of continuity. Then came the line that caused the entire disaster. I will see to it that their place remains secure. There it was. The promise. Except it still didn't say what Camilla claimed it said. No estate was named. No length of residence was listed. No legal transfer was described. Just their place. A phrase wide enough to mean respect. A phrase dangerous enough to mean property. Camilla said Charles knew exactly what he meant. Anne asked whether William knew. Silence. William had never seen the note. He had never agreed. He hadn't even been told the conversation had happened. Yet his future consent had been used as the foundation beneath the entire promise. William looked at Charles. You promised my agreement without asking me. Charles tried to explain. He said he believed William would behave generously. There's that word, generously. As though refusing to hand over control would make William selfish. Anne heard the pressure immediately, so she cut through it. You don't get to give away another person's generosity. That was when Camilla turned on Anne. Not loudly, coldly. She asked why Anne had suddenly joined William against her. Anne's answer changed the entire room. I joined him the moment you started calling an expectation a right. Camilla closed the red box. She said Anne had been present during one of the original conversations. Wait, what? Anne didn't deny it. She had been there. Years earlier, during a tense family gathering, when questions about the future had become impossible to avoid. Camilla had asked what would happen to her children when Charles was gone. Not what titles they would receive, not what money they would inherit. What would happen to them? Charles had replied that they would not be pushed aside. He would make certain William treated them fairly. Camilla remembered a promise. Charles remembered reassurance. But Anne remembered the exact final sentence, because she had challenged it at the time. Charles had said, I'll ask William to ensure they are comfortable. Ask. Not order. Not require. Ask. That single word destroyed the entire claim. Camilla said Anne was twisting a private conversation. Anne walked to the folder, removed a yellowing page, then placed it beside Charles's note. She had written down the exchange that same evening. Date, location, who was present, what was said, what was said. Anne didn't keep the record because she expected a future scandal. She kept it because Charles had a habit of making emotional promises during difficult moments, then leaving someone else to define what those promises meant. And this time, that someone was William. If you're seeing the pattern before the people inside that room admitted it, subscribe, because the final document made Charles's vague promise look harmless. It wasn't. Anne's record proved Camilla's family had never been promised ownership. But it also revealed they had been promised something else. A formal consultation before any access was withdrawn. That was real. Not permanent residence. Not inheritance. A consultation. William couldn't simply make the decision in silence. He had to hear them. He had to consider the family's position. He had to give them the dignity Charles had described. But he did not have to surrender the estate. Camilla should have accepted that. Instead, she asked why the later draft used the words, shall remain protected. William answered before anyone else could. Because someone wanted the consultation to look like a guarantee. Then he revealed what his legal advisor had found. The stronger language had not come from Charles. It had been inserted into a private summary prepared after a meeting with Camilla's representatives. Not Camilla personally. Not Tom or Laura. Advisors. People paid to remove uncertainty. People who understood that soft language creates weak claims. So may be considered became shall remain protected. Consultation became continuity. Personal assurance became established understanding. Nobody forged Charles's handwriting. They didn't need to. They built a legal-looking structure around his emotional words, then waited for time to make the structure feel real. Charles looked furious, but not at the advisors, at William, because William had exposed the trick publicly inside the family instead of quietly making it disappear. That was when Anne finally turned on her brother. "You're angry at the wrong person." Charles said he was trying to avoid unnecessary humiliation. Anne stepped closer. "Whose humiliation? Camilla's? Her children's? The king's? Or the son who would eventually be blamed for correcting a promise he never made?" Charles lowered his voice. He said William's refusal could create a permanent break between the families. William's expression hardened. "There was already a break. You covered it with my name." That sentence ended the argument. For about 5 seconds. Then Camilla opened the red box again. There was another paper beneath Charles's note, a typed memorandum. This one carried initials. Charles's initials. Camilla placed it in front of Anne. The room changed instantly, because the memorandum named the property. It described a future arrangement. It even referred to continued family use after a change in reign. William read it slowly, then read it again. The initials looked genuine. The document looked devastating. Had Charles been lying? Had Anne defended him only to discover he really had promised the estate? Camilla watched William's face and knew she finally had him. Then Anne asked one question. "Where is page 2? Camilla said there was no page 2. Anne lifted the memorandum toward the light. A page number was printed in the lower corner. 1 of 2. The second page was missing. Charles looked toward the red box. Camilla didn't. That told William everything. He reached inside and removed the remaining papers. Nothing. No second page. The strongest document in Camilla's case had been separated from its ending. Why? Because page 2 contained the condition. The arrangement would apply only if the property remained under Charles's personal ownership at the time of succession. But it wouldn't. The property was scheduled to return to the wider estate structure, meaning Charles could recommend continued use. He could ask, he could express a wish, but he could not guarantee an outcome after control passed elsewhere. The missing page didn't just weaken the promise. It reversed it. Charles had signed a memorandum acknowledging that the final decision would belong to the future sovereign and the relevant estate authority. William had not inherited an obligation. He had inherited a request. Camilla said she had never removed the page. Anne believed her. That surprised everyone, because Anne had finally understood what happened. The document had passed through too many hands. Charles's private office, Camilla's advisors, estate representatives, lawyers. Someone had copied the first page because it looked like a promise. The second page looked like a limitation. So over time, the promise survived. The limitation disappeared, not through one dramatic conspiracy, through something more believable: convenience. People preserved the words that benefited them. They forgot the words that didn't. But Anne wasn't finished. She had located a duplicate of page 2. That was what was inside the blue folder she slammed onto the table. And attached to it was a handwritten instruction from Charles. William must retain complete discretion. Charles had protected William after all. Quietly, legally, but emotionally, he had done the opposite. He had told Camilla enough to make her family feel secure. He had written enough to make them expect continuity. Then he added a private limitation that meant William could still refuse. Charles had tried to comfort both sides with different versions of the future. Camilla heard certainty. William inherited discretion. Charles kept the peace only by ensuring the explosion happened later. After the words had hardened, after expectations had grown, after refusal could be painted as betrayal. Anne looked at him with something worse than anger. Disappointment. You knew this day would come. Charles didn't answer. He didn't need to. William gathered the papers. He said Camilla's family would receive the consultation they had genuinely been promised. They would be heard. They would be treated respectfully. They would be given time to make arrangements. But the estate would not become a private inheritance. No automatic occupation. No permanent right. No decision made through emotional pressure. Camilla asked whether Charles's wishes meant nothing. William paused. Then he gave the answer Charles should have given years earlier. His wishes matter. They don't erase everyone else's rights. Anne closed the red box. Charles sat down. For the first time that evening, he looked less like a king than a man watching every delayed consequence arrive at once. Camilla's family had been promised dignity. They had been promised consultation. They had been promised that they would not be discarded like embarrassing leftovers from a previous reign. But they had never been promised ownership. The estate was never theirs. The guarantee was never real. The only thing Charles had truly promised was that William would face the decision Charles himself had been too frightened to make. Anne walked to the door, then stopped. She looked back at her brother. You tried to protect everyone from one painful answer. Charles raised his eyes. Anne's voice softened. But all you did was make William deliver it. Then she left. William kept the original documents. Camilla kept Charles's handwritten note. Charles kept the crown. But sitting alone at that table, he finally understood that the crown was the least powerful thing in the room. The truth was already in William's hands. Tell me below, did Anne protect the monarchy that night, or did she expose her own brother to save William?